My presentation deals with globalization, but from a slightly different perspective than we normally talk about it. And it provides a stepping stone to understanding the work that Mathis Wackernagel will be presenting to you a little bit later. The context from which I look at globalization is really explained by this curve of human population growth and indeed the growth of the human enterprise. You can see this is 2,000 years of history in which there was essentially no growth until the last 150 or 200 years. And in fact, we could extend the x-axis 50,000 years to the left, and it would remain essentially flat. Only about 8 or 9 generations of humans have experienced sufficient growth in their lifetimes to acknowledge and recognize it. Yet, because we are all of those generations, we consider this recent period to be the norm. And the point I'm trying to make with this graph is that this recent period of expanding human enterprise is the single most anomalous or abnormal period in the history of our species. And it's made possible largely by abundant, cheap energy, which has enabled us to acquire all the other resources necessary to sustain the growth of the human enterprise. So we, in effect, have become a rogue species on the planet. Fossil fuel has eliminated, or at least reduced, much of the negative feedback that would normally keep our populations in check. So we produce more food, we can produce more resources, we can eliminate disease, and hence release our species to expand. For that reason, we have become the dominant species on Earth and the major geological force affecting the face of the planet. The problem is that this dysfunction is destroying the ecosystems that sustain civilization and undermine the life support. We are undermining the life support functions that are necessary for civilization. And you're all familiar with some of the trends: climate change, ocean acidification, fisheries collapses, and so on. In short, these are the measures by which we assert that the human enterprise has exceeded the long-term carrying capacity of the Earth and is in a state of overshoot. In effect, this is merely the modern representation of a very old concern that goes back to Reverend Thomas Mathis in 1798 in his famous essay on population. He recognized that the human condition would always be constrained by pressing up against carrying capacity. In many respects, from the ecological perspective, we have to begin to understand that the Earth is like a large ship. In fact, Kenneth Boulding described it as a spaceship. But every ship has a carrying capacity, which is clearly indicated on the hull by something called the Plimsoll line, or the Plimsoll mark. And it tells us how much we can load onto that ship safely. And we know that we should not overload the ship, or it will go down in rough seas. Well, why can't we think of ourselves on the planet spaceship Earth in that kind of framework? Why does the modern form of overshoot matter? It matters because the Earth systems, the climate system, the ecological systems, even our economic and social systems, are what we call complex systems. They have multiple equilibrium states. Some of them are comfortable, and some of them are not. Modern industrial civilization has developed and evolved in a very stable climate regime, for example. But there are at least 5 trends occurring now in the world that are sufficiently large to destabilize the system and push it into a different state. This is human population growth and rising material consumption, habitat transformation and fragmentation, which leads to biodiversity loss, energy production and consumption, climate change. All of these things exceed, both in the rate of change and in the magnitude of change, the kinds of forces that in geological times resulted in the state shift, the shifting of a planetary system to a very different equilibrium point that could no longer sustain or support the life forms that existed previously. A very recent paper in Nature magazine makes the point that given the scale, the sheer size of human impacts, quote, another global scale state shift is highly plausible within decades to centuries if it has not already been initiated. And by that they mean the concern of some climate scientists that we may already have passed the point of no return and are approaching tipping points where the global climate regime may shift into a domain of stability that can no longer support the kind of civilization that we have evolved. Overshoot is an invitation to collapse. One planet living refers to the level of consumption at carrying capacity, beyond which it is dangerous to go. If we remain below carrying capacity, consuming at the rate nature produces and dumping wastes at the rate nature can assimilate, we are not in trouble. But if there's a persistent increase, both in population and in per capita consumption, then the human enterprise goes into a state of overshoot by exceeding the long-term productive potential of ecosystems. At that point, the growth is supported by degrading and depleting the biological basis of civilization. So fisheries collapse, forests retreat, soils erode vastly more quickly than they can be replenished, and so on. Climate changes. Eventually you reach a point at which there's insufficient natural capital to sustain the existing levels of consumption and population, and a crash ensues. And frankly, that has been the history of most major civilizations prior to our present global civilization. Despite this recognition, I think most leaders have at one point or other recognized that we are in an unsustainable state. But despite that, and despite the problems then caused by our excessive economic scale, even at the Rio Earth Summit, Rio +20 in Brazil just this past June, the final report, called The Future We Want, requires no country to do anything in particular and actually equates sustainable development with sustaining material economic growth. As a result of that, some journalists and activists have called the conference, in the case of George Monbiot, a very well-known British environmental journalist, the greatest failure of collective leadership since the First World War. The Future We Want has also been called the longest suicide note in history by Mr. Naidoo, the international chair of the Greenpeace organization. Now, the kind of belief system upon which most of our economic planning takes place in Western nations and in the United Nations is sustained by something called the progress myth and the myth of perpetual growth. Here's just one quote from Lawrence Summers, which he made when he was the the chief economist of the World Bank. He subsequently went on with the same beliefs to become the president of Harvard University. And of course, he was President Obama's senior economic advisor as the chair of the Presidential Council of Economic Advisors until relatively recently. There are no limits to the carrying capacity of the Earth that are likely to bind at any time in the foreseeable future. The idea that we should put limits to growth because of some natural limit is a profound error with staggering social costs. Now, this is predicated on the belief that the only way to solve the human dilemma of gross poverty that is still suffered by 2 to 3 billion people on Earth is through continued economic growth. So in theory, as the global economy expands, trade, technology, and increased wealth will enable humanity to compensate for, to substitute for, the depletion of natural resources and the loss of life support services. In effect, the belief here is that humans are capable of continuously increasing global carrying capacity. And of course, the expansion of the last 150 years or so is an indication that in the short term, we have indeed been remarkably successful at increasing the capacity of systems to sustain human existence. Currently, globalization is seen as the major instrument by which this process will take place. Globalization implies the effective dissolution, from an economic perspective at least, of national boundaries. and the horizontal integration of the economy into one. Trade rules therefore encourage countries to specialize in a few economic products that they do best. In other words, each country should do those few things for which it has a comparative advantage and can do these things most efficiently. This enables them to earn income from exporting those specialized products, and with that income, they can buy everything else from other specialists in the global economy. The fundamental assumptions here are quite rational and in fact work perfectly well. If each country specializes in products for which it has a comparative advantage and which it is most efficient, then we maximize global production. Because goods are being produced efficiently and with the largest possible market, prices will be lower and demand higher. For these reasons, global incomes increase. Absolutely the case. Higher incomes and lower prices enable people to maximize consumption of goods from all over the world. In short, more liberal trade facilitates the growth in gross world product, both production and consumption, and increases the carrying capacity of the planet at least costs. And I have no argument whatsoever with the fundamental logic of this well-known and essentially 19th century trade theory. The question is, it's all occurring on a finite planet. And the whole purpose of this exercise is to continue the growth of the human enterprise within the constraints of finite ecosystems. The assumptions behind this, however, are open to challenge. A primary assumption is that higher income and consumption will always increase human well-being. A second assumption is that because of technology, human ingenuity, there are no ecological impediments to continuous economic growth. If there is resource scarcity, this can be relieved by enhanced factor productivity, or efficiency if you like, or substitution. If we run out of wild fish, we can always build fish farms. So we don't really need nature. In fact, a famous statement by a Nobel laureate economist is, if we can substitute other factors for natural resources, then in effect the world can get along without natural resources, so exhaustion is merely an event, not a catastrophe. And if we believe these sorts of things, then indeed growth does appear to be unlimited and unconstrained. The final assumption is that ecological stability and geopolitical security are assured. There is no threat from climate change or aggressive competition for resources. That was the fundamental belief expressed by Lawrence Summers. And my point today will be that all of these assumptions are proving to be false. One of the ways we demonstrate that is through the work that Mathis and I have been working, and many of our students, Yoshi Wada, professor in one of your local universities, all right, he could tell us about it, is here. I'm thrilled to be able to see former students of mine in such an audience as this. We've been working very hard to promote the kinds of ideas we'll now be talking about. They all have to do with a different way of looking at carrying capacity. The old definition asked this question: how many people can this area support? Or how many people can the Earth support? And if you can trade infinitely, that is an irrelevant question. But if you turn the ratio over, it begins to have meaning again. So instead of asking how large a population can this area support, we ask in eco-footprint analysis, how large an area of ecosystems is required to support a given population, wherever on Earth those ecosystems are found. So we can define the ecological footprint of an individual, a city, a country, or the entire world this way. It is the total area of land and water ecosystems required on a continuous, ongoing basis to produce the renewable resources that the population consumes and to assimilate the major wastes that that population produces wherever on Earth that land and water ecosystem may be found. Because when you trade, you are importing carrying capacity from someplace else. And what this really means, and which is becoming increasingly obvious in the world's marketplaces, is that every person is competing with every other person. Every country is competing with every other country for the limited resources on this Earth. And we do so these days through commercial trade. This is a representation of the average ecological footprints, the hectares of biocapacity required per capita to sustain the lifestyles of some of the countries on the planet. And you can see the United States, Canada, Australia have very large footprints. We're relatively inefficient countries with an enormous incomes and very high levels of consumption. I've put Japan in a slightly dark bar to hold it out. Again, a very high income country with a high lifestyle. We see very poor countries on the right. Many countries like Malawi and Bangladesh have eco-footprints 1/20th of that of countries like Canada, the United States. The far right is the average footprint of a human being on planet today. The red horizontal line is the average amount, not the average amount, but the area of productive ecosystem available per capita on Earth. That's the level at which we should all be if we wish to live within global carrying capacity. Already then, we are exceeding, on average, one planet living by about 50%. The human enterprise is 50% over the long-term carrying capacity of the planet. But if you look at this graph carefully, you'll see that many countries on the far left are 4 or 5 times over their fair share, as it were, of the world's ecosystem. I'll just quickly look at this. On Earth today, there's only about 12 billion hectares, but we're using the equivalent in terms of our consumption of the output of 18.2 billion hectares, hence 50% overshoot. Average eco-footprint is 2.8 average hectares per capita. There are only 1.8 available per person on the Earth. We're in 50% overshoot. Therefore, it takes the ecosphere about 1.5 years to generate as much new biocapacity and assimilative capacity as we use in each year. So that's a summary of the current state of affairs. And we show it in this way through very detailed analyses of energy and material flows, but it shows up in other ways: climate change, fisheries collapses, soil erosion, the disappearance of tropical forests, and so on. Now, this is where it gets very interesting. Many countries, particularly high-income and highly densely populated countries, have eco-footprints that are vastly larger than their domestic carrying capacity, their domestic biocapacity. So the green bars represent domestic biocapacity per capita. The red bars represent the per capita ecological footprints, the actual demand by people in those countries. So you can see if we look at Japan, it's the 5th one in from the left. Japan uses, in other places from other countries and in the global commons, 7 or 8 times as much biocapacity as is actually contained within its own domestic borders. In other words, the act of globalization, the increase in global trade, enables countries in this condition greatly to exceed, to grow beyond their domestic carrying capacity, but in the process becoming increasingly dependent on the surpluses in other countries and in the underutilized global commons. Canada, the country with a huge green domestic biocapacity bar on the right, is one of the very few countries on Earth that still has a significant biocapacity surplus. But in some ways, this is a false surplus, because for every country running a deficit, there has to be some other place, either another country or the global commons, that runs a surplus to fill in that deficit. So most of the Canadian surplus has been absorbed in trade with other nations. This is a graph showing, for the Canadian prairies, we've done a very recent and very detailed assessment of the fate of crop production in the Canadian Great Plains, one of the world's great bread baskets. Thank you very much. And what we see here is the total area of land. These are real hectares, not global average hectares, involved in agricultural production. And you can see that in general, the share dedicated to export crops is increasing. So more and more of the Canadian domestic biocapacity, and by the way, you'll notice here it's over half. So when we see in the Canadian context that the surplus, shown by the very large green bar being much larger than the red ecological footprint of Canadians, which is large enough, it turns out that half or more of our agricultural produce is exported, just illustrating how our surpluses are actually absorbed by other nations on the planet. This looks at those exports in terms of the different kinds of land involved: cropland, pasture land, feed land, meaning a cropland that is used to grow feed for animals, and the carbon footprint is represented here as the energy land. This is the carbon sink required to assimilate the fossil fuel used in the production of these crops. So to summarize, just for Canada, one of these countries with a so-called surplus, on average, for the period of this study from 1989 to 2007, 65% of Canadian prairie cropland was effectively exported to satisfy the deficits in other countries. During this period, the total foreign eco-footprint on the prairies, so in effect what I'm measuring here is the ecological footprint of consumption in other countries on the land base of the Canadian prairies. So during our study period, the total foreign eco-footprint increased significantly to 34 million real hectares. And this is an area equivalent in size to the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Denmark combined. So that's how much land in that one region of Canada that is effectively now being used by others. And this means we've created a dependency relationship that is two-way, but nevertheless we must ask whether it has potential for long-term stability. This is how that land is broken up. You can see that the United States is a major consumer of Canadian grain. We'll get to that in a moment, and other agricultural products from the prairies. Asia is second: China, Japan, and other Asian countries, with the EU, Latin America, and others pulling up the rear. Let's look at this from a different perspective. I want now to turn briefly to the United States. The United States is an enormous food producer, but it's also increasingly an enormous importer of food. So that between 1995 and 2005, the United States imported fruit, vegetables, meat, and forest products, we included here, in an increasing manner. So there was a steady increase, which on average during this period represented 141 million hectares of real hectares in other countries. Half of that area is cropland, and about half is forest land. So this is what US imports look like in a very crude way. The point here again is that it's steadily increasing through the period of this study. The United States, in other words, is steadily becoming more dependent for certain key food imports and certainly forest products imports on other countries, despite being, at least in financial terms, a net exporter of grain. This is what the curve looks like for meat alone. You can see that the number of livestock imported is steadily rising. That is to say, the processed meat livestock equivalent. The black bar represents the linear interpretation of the increase in the hectares of land sustained, or imported rather, to support the meat imports into the United States. A steady increase. Similarly with vegetables, a steady accelerating increase actually. So again, the point I want to emphasize here is that globalization, the opening up of national borders to trade with other countries, is resulting in this enormous increase in resource flows that has the tendency to draw down surpluses in those surplus countries while creating unsustainable dependencies in the import countries. So how large is the United States ecological footprint just in these 3 or 4 categories: livestock, vegetable production, and wood products on other countries? The US imports represent an extraterritorial area, an area of land outside the United States equivalent to 18% of the area of the United States, excluding Alaska. This is an area approximately the size of Germany, Italy, Spain, and the United Kingdom combined. This is not a trivial set of relationships, okay? So if we start to think of this, going back to that distribution of footprints, wealth enables rich countries to appropriate underutilized carrying capacity in other countries and to overexploit the global commons. Globalization then allows us to use paper wealth to acquire the real wealth of developing and resource-rich countries. Rich, powerful nations, all of which are in exceedance of their domestic carrying capacities, can achieve through globalization through commercial trade flows what used to require territorial occupation. So we're engaged, I think, unconsciously and not maliciously, it just happens to be the way this is unfolding, in an increasingly unsustainable entanglement of nations. We are creating transnational relationships of dependence, which in an era of rapid climate change, increasing competition for resources, may lead to geopolitical disruption, which will disrupt or render incapable of maintaining those trade flows. What we're getting then out of specialization and trade in a growing economy on a finite planet is that every country is becoming dependent on others for various essential goods and commodities. Trade in biocapacity stimulates material and population growth. Just as economists predicted, it will increase the apparent carrying capacity because populations and consumptions rise in response to the availability of more goods and services. But this enables all trading partners to exceed their domestic carrying capacities even as the trade relationships deplete the remaining resource stocks elsewhere. This means that every trade-dependent region is increasingly vulnerable to both supply and price shocks in the global marketplace. One consequence of price shocks is that some countries no longer rely on markets, but are instead purchasing outright or leasing on long-term arrangements the actual productive biocapacity of other countries. So Zaire, Congo, and so on are seeing vast tracts of land in the millions of hectares purchased by countries like China, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and so on. These countries are desperate to acquire the biocapacity that they no longer have within their own boundaries. The second major point is that because of these linkages between nations and the fact that we are drawing down surpluses everywhere, this means that all nations reach global carrying capacity more or less at the same time, and there will be no surplus remaining. So climate change is an indication of a global phenomenon of where we've exceeded the capacity of a waste sink, and we all suffer the consequences, even though some countries are innocent of any real contribution to the carbon loading on the planet. I would argue that these trends, the blind dedication to continued material growth through economic relationships on a finite planet, are fundamentally unsustainable. Globalization will turn out to be disastrous if key underlying assumptions are violated. For example, consider the effect on national security if import-dependent nations find that the relationship is undermined by long-term drought, if climate change induces sea level rise and permanently floods coastal plains and prime agricultural lands. We saw a little bit of a taste of this with the hurricane that struck the eastern United States this week. There is the potential with sea level rise for millions of people to be displaced from productive landscapes that are no longer available to supply either them or anyone else. And the point is that these kinds of events seem virtually inevitable in the type of world we are creating. Many studies support these kinds of observations, but from a different perspective. This is a couple of quotes from authors of The Age of Consequences. They predict an inevitable scenario in which people and nations are threatened by massive food and water shortages, devastating natural disasters, and deadly disease outbreaks. Rich countries, and this is really is illustrated very much by the work I've just described, could go through a 30-year period of kicking people away from the lifeboat as the world's poorest people face the worst environmental consequences of global change, climate change, and so on. So they're essentially in this work describing the increasing global tensions that are likely to arise as human-induced global ecological change disrupts the relationships established economically between nations in a relatively stable period. So we've created a global system that is dependent on stability when that stability is being undermined by the very scale of the global system. So here are some questions I think we should have asked 20 or 30 or 40 years ago that we should begin to ask now. What are the ecological, economic, and moral implications of encouraging ever more dependent trade relationships that may not be sustainable given global change and resource scarcity? Is it wise for any nation to commit its own well-being and future development to foreign production and vulnerable imports? What risks does a nation assume by committing substantial portions of its own limited land base to extraterritorial consumers? If we export and we create a dependence over there, and then we need the product of the land we're exporting, tensions are immediately created between ourselves and the dependent populations that are currently being supported by our exports. How can trade rules be modified to inhibit the overexploitation of critical forms of natural capital? There's nothing wrong with trade, and I hope nobody is taking this to be a diatribe against trade. It's not against trade per se. It's against trade that doesn't acknowledge the context within which trade is occurring. We need trade. Many countries couldn't survive without it. But we need to regulate that trade in ways that respect the productive capacities of the ecological systems that are sustaining that trade. And so far, we've paid relatively little attention to those kinds of constraints. So what strategies can trade-dependent countries employ to enhance the security of supply? For example, maybe trading nations should join together in the sustainable management of the productive land base upon which one is dependent for the supplies and the other is dependent for income. Well, we see no such thing. What instead we see is the competitive bidding down of resource prices, which destroys the economic surpluses necessary to husband the natural resources. We then have to ask, at what point do the benefits of self-reliance and enhanced security balance the sustained, or rather the assumed, gains from trade? It may be better for some countries to revert to a much more self-reliant frame of mind than the increasingly trade-dependent frame of mind that is abroad in the world today. On the potentially positive side, let's recognize that the sustainability of any region within the global system is increasingly dependent on the sustainability of various other distant regions. No country can go it alone on this planet today. This means that for the first time in the evolutionary history of Homo sapiens, of our species, short-term individual and tribal self-interest, or if you like, national interest, has all but converged with humanity's long-term collective interest. Sustainability is a collective problem requiring unprecedented levels of cooperative development between nations, within nations, to solve a mutual problem which no nation can solve on its own. The danger is that some nations will try to do so by subsuming the resources of other countries in the kinds of conflicts that we have seen take place historically. I would argue then that mutual survival requires that the short-term interests and competitive relationships must give way to long-term interests and international cooperation to salvage what remains of the essential natural capital base, the biodiversity upon which the entire human edifice is dependent. Our mission, then, is that global society must organize to abandon a socially constructed perpetual growth myth in favor of a more equitable, steady-state economy operating well within the means of nature. In other words, what is the long-term productive potential of ecosystems, and how can that be distributed equitably among people, in ways that enable us all to live decently without destroying the biological underpinnings of the entire global edifice? This means that we must consciously and enhance security balance the sustained, or rather the assumed, gains from trade. It may be better for some countries to revert to a much more self-reliant frame of mind than the increasingly trade-dependent frame of mind that is abroad in the world today. On the potentially positive side, let's recognize that the sustainability of any region within the global system is increasingly dependent on the sustainability of various other distant regions. No country can go it alone on this planet today. This means that for the first time in the evolutionary history of Homo sapiens, of our species, short-term individual and tribal self-interest, or if you like, national interest, has all but converged with humanity's long-term collective interest. Sustainability is a collective problem requiring unprecedented levels of cooperative development between nations, within nations, to solve a mutual problem which no nation can solve on its own. The danger is that some nations will try to do so by subsuming the resources of other countries in the kinds of conflicts that we have seen take place historically. I would argue then that mutual survival requires that the short-term interests and competitive relationships must give way to long-term interests and international cooperation to salvage what remains of the essential natural capital base, the biodiversity upon which the entire human edifice is dependent. Our mission, then, is that global society must organize to abandon a socially constructed perpetual growth myth in favor of a more equitable, steady-state economy operating well within the means of nature. In other words, what is the long-term productive potential of ecosystems, and how can that be distributed equitably among people, thank you, in ways that enable us all to live decently without destroying the biological underpinnings of the entire global edifice. This means that we must consciously participate together, cooperate in scripting, in writing a new cultural narrative that shifts the values of society from competitive individualism, greed, and narrow self-interests toward community, sharing, cooperation, and what is really our collective interest in restoring the life support functions of the ecosphere. Now, human beings are a unique species. We should be proud of ourselves and our evolutionary history. The whole story I have described is really a story of quite remarkable achievement in the struggle for existence on this planet. But it's not a complete story as yet. We have become somewhat over-enthusiastic about the current cultural growth narrative, such that it's undermining all of our future potential. So here's what I think we must recognize. There are 4 key qualities of human beings that we have either exclusively or to a greater degree than any other species. The first is high intelligence, the capacity to reason logically from the evidence. The second is completely unique. We have an ability to plan ahead, to use the results of our analyses to change our own future. We have the capacity to assert moral judgment, to distinguish right from wrong, to recognize that the increasing income gap, the increasing sustainability gap is unsustainable and immoral. We have the ability to extend compassion to people who are suffering or to other species with whom we share this blue planet. The problem today is that if you look at the rate at which the worst of these trends are accelerating, we seem to have abandoned these fundamental and unique qualities of being human. So we really must rise to the challenge of exercising those capacities that distinguish us from other species, that separate us from the ordinary. Intelligence, the ability to plan ahead collectively. By the way, I could put another point here. Another unique quality is the degree to which we have evolved cooperative enterprises to achieve mutual benefit. So with those 5 qualities, we can pull it off. We can solve the sustainability dilemma. But if we continue to be in denial about the nature of the problem, if we continue to be seduced by a false system of perpetual progress and growth, which is really not producing benefits even in the rich countries any longer, then the prospects for human civilization become dimmer, and I think we would all regret the destruction from human activities of the productive bounty of the blue planet. Thank you very much for your attention.